Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Troubling the Waters, Part 1 of our Square Pegs and Round Holes author webinar. My name is Patty Webb, and I am the Marketing Manager for Stylus Publishing. Stylus webinars bring you direct access to our authors and our latest titles. Square Pegs and Round Holes, Alternative Approaches to Diverse College Student Development Theory was published this March and is edited by Dr. Fred Bonner, Dr. Rosie Banda, Dr. Stella Smith, and Aretha Marbley. This webinar will be recorded and made available next week on the Stylus YouTube channel. We encourage you all to share questions and comments via the chat bar and the QA function on your screen. So without further ado, I will pass the mic to lead editor, Fred Bonner.
Thank you, Patty. It gives me the pleasure to introduce our moderator and co-moderator for today. The moderator is Dr. Jamie Washington, President and founder of the Washington Consulting Group. And the Washington Consulting Group has been recognized as the top 10 consulting firm in the country. But just a little bit more personal about my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Jamie Washington. He has been a scholar, advocate, leader in the field of higher education for the past 37 years. And most notably, he is the past president of the American College Personnel Association, affectionately known as ACPA. So Dr. Washington will lead us, and he will be joined by co-moderator, Dr. Stella Smith. Dr. Smith is my right hand at the Mach 3 Center, the Minority Achievement, Creativity, and High Ability Center at Prairie View A&M University. So I'm turning it over to these two great hands to lead us through this discussion about square pegs and round holes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bonner, and it is indeed a pleasure and an honor to be here with my colleague, Dr. Smith. And let's just have some fun and conversation, right? So what this reminds me of so much is when I started this journey in higher education, and when I started learning about what student development meant, and that there was actually a developmental process. Oh my, who knew? And how that mattered. And so I am delighted to have this moment. I'm Jamie Washington. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I am joining you from the original unceded homelands of the Piscataway tribal nations here in the Baltimore, Washington area. And my facilitator, Dr. Smith.
Yes, my name is Stella Smith. I am the Associate Director of the Mach 3 Center and one of the editors for this amazing volume. And I am just so happy to be here with you all and to be part of a conversation about this incredible work definitely needed in the field.
Excellent. So good. So we are going to, again, this is very much intended to be a conversational experience, right? And we're going to share a lot. And so we invite you to pay attention to your context, right? So as we enter this conversation this afternoon, we want you to think about, as we move into the content of student development, we want you to think about the context in which you engaging it. So am I engaging this as a graduate student, right? Am I engaging this as a new professional? Am I engaging this work as a faculty member, right? Teaching this, right? So stay present in your context, because there might be different questions that are arising for you based upon the context that you are in, at this moment. And the questions might look different for you as you move through later on. So again, so good to see nearly 60 of us in the room at this time, preparing for this conversation. Square pegs and round holes, alternative approaches to diverse college student development theory. There's a lot of amazing work that's being done right now. In the last 10 to 15 years, what we've heard a lot is, well, what about, right? Well, what about? And that the groundswell over the last 20 or so years in the work have invited the scholarship of folks like Doctors Banda, Smith, and Bonner to say, well, let's talk about, right? Let's talk about the what about, and whose voices and experiences are not reflected in these not unuseful frameworks, right? So again, we don't want to, we recognize the shoulders that we stand on as we move into this space, but we're preparing for the next round, right? And so who are the voices? What are the voices and experiences that are not reflected? When Dr. Banda called me and invited me to do this forward, first I was excited on many levels, right? Because the opportunity to, just kind of speak to what I have watched and noticed over these last 37 years has been really special. So I'm just going to do the first part of the forward and then move us right into questions. So I use these as quotes. I'm not feeling this framework speaks to my experience as a queer man of color. I feel, it feels to me like this was written to address a 19-year-old college student, and I have a child that's 19 years old. This model does not take into account the difference between sexual orientation and gender identity. I know I'm a person of color, but this framework that you're offering seems to be more about the Black experience. Square pegs and round holes. Here's our conversation for today. I want to just invite the editors to just talk about, we're going to talk in a moment about kind of the content, right? How we got to the content, but talk a little bit about your process, right? So what was going on that had you all decide we should probably do something, right? So what were you seeing, what were you experiencing? And so I'm actually going to start with Dr. Banda, if you don't mind. Am I saying your last name? Is it Banda? What's it?
It's Banda.
Banda. Okay,
right. Yes,
okay, good. All right. So, well, just kind of how you all kind of came together and came up with this thing. So, from your space.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Dr. Washington and Dr. Smith and Dr. Banda, everybody else, the rest of our colleagues. It's great to see everybody on a Thursday. I think this book is kind of a labor of love in many ways because it's very personal. Prior to coming to, I'm at Texas A&M University, Corpus Christi right now. I'm an associate professor, just got tenured, but I'm an associate professor. And I teach only doctoral students, our EDD program. But this book started really when I was working as a postdoc with Dr. Bonner, because I remember on top of the 20 other books Dr. Bonner had going at the time, like he was like, we've got to do this, and had the title. I remember it being up on the dry erase board. And it took a while to get here, right? But I think it's a labor of love, right? Because oftentimes, as you see more diversity and you see the strengths of people of color, historically marginalized people in academia, getting past not just the undergrad, but the master's and the doctoral level, some of those course readings, I kind of noticed like, well, that's not really me. That's part of me, but that's not really me. And so I think that's just it is a labor of love because it's so personal. It's kind of one of those where we talked about different concepts and the great models that came before us, but that they were norm reference on other populations that were not for people of color or all the other intersectionalities that we have. And so in many ways, I think this is kind of a call to say, we don't need to, we need to no longer pick and choose what we use from existing antiquated models. But it's really time to really start conceptually and empirically having models that really speak to our own identity development across, right, the nuances of each population. And so for me, that's why, it's always great to work with Dr. Bonner and Dr. Smith and Dr. Marvin as well, and the rest of our colleagues who, the scholars who contributed in the book, as well as you, Dr. Washington. I think that kind of it's a labor of love for everybody. So I think when you read the book, it comes from a very authentic, very human, very personal perspective. Something I think that we probably need a lot more of today. So
excellent. Thank you, Dr. Banda. Yeah, good. Dr. Smith.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. I was just resonating and thinking about all of what Dr. Banda said, but also I think about our voices. And so other people often write our stories. So even if the stories of more marginalized, underrepresented students are in the literature, they might not be written from the perspective of those of us that are part of that community. What I think is so special about Square Pegs is that we are writing our own stories and talking about the ways in which we develop through language and with a keen understanding, a cultural competence that sometimes is lacking, although the information might be correct. The way in which it's presented isn't couched in a context that helps it be presented in a positive way. And as Dr. Banda was saying, like when I was in my doctoral program, I remember being highly upset in classes over and over again because I knew that the theories that we were learning didn't represent the community that I came from. And so for this particular project, it was a labor of love in that I had promised myself in my doctoral program, if I ever had the opportunity to be the one that wrote the books and talked about our families and the ways in which our students learn in an asset-based way, I would take advantage of that. This was the first project that I worked on as associate director here at Mach 3. So it really was very much, in addition to kind of the pre-work that was done, I think of it as definitely a labor of love, and the first kind of product that connected to me as changing the literature, me as adding to literature, and ensuring that those students that come after us have books and have materials that more accurately represent our experiences.
Very powerful. Absolutely. Absolutely. So what I'm particularly resonating with was the first part of your framing around there was stuff written about us, but not by us. Right. Mm-hmm. So again, access to writing, right? Access to publishing, access to having our voices and our stories told, that sometimes wasn't even allowed in dissertation work, right? That our stories, our experiences as different than that of what these theories and frameworks were normed on were not seen as valid or welcome, right? Mm-hmm. And so this project also speaks to the importance of that, right? In terms of being able to reference, right? So again, in the scholarship space, the ability to reference, right? That empirical work that has been done before. Dr. Bonner, yes, why don't you come on in and give us a little bit about your process around this? Thanks.
Yes, sir, Dr. Watson, you called my name, let me sit up straight. Well, for me, this book, it almost reminds me of that gospel tune, my soul looks back and wonders how I made it over, because this started so long ago for me as a doctoral student myself at the University of Arkansas in the Higher Ed and Student Affairs program, and then taking my first job in Higher Ed and Student Affairs at Bowling Green State University. And then, and at that time, that's the CSA program, College Student Affairs program. Left there, went to UT San Antonio to the AHE program, Adult and Higher Ed, then to Texas A&M to the SAHE program, Student Affairs Administration in Higher Ed, then on to Rutgers to the CSA program, College Student Affairs, and now I've landed at Prairie View in ELAC, Educational Leadership and Counseling. And across all those contexts, I taught college student development theory. And one of the things that I noticed back then as a student and now as a higher ed professional, as a faculty member, is that the stories never were completely congruent with who I was. And not only my story and not only my experiences, the experiences of my colleagues, the experiences of my students. So I was determined to tell a different narrative, a counter narrative, as we say, because the prevailing narrative, it was typically the stream. We went from, Erickson to Perry to Aston to Kohlberg to Gilligan to Schlossberg to Tinto, and then start the loop again. And every now and then you would jump out and talk about Cass and Helm. Well, I'm like, there's more to our experiences as diverse people and people of color that should fit into this pantheon of literature related to college student development theory. So having taught college student development theory, and at A&M, I created a course, Advanced College Student Development Theory, just because, and the advanced piece was that I wanted to include some theories that weren't typically on the radar screen. but I didn't have a book, didn't have a compendium at that time that had all of those theories together. So I thought, whenever I get the chance, I'm going to push forward and foreground a book where we have some alternative approaches to college student development theory that reflect me, look like me, where I don't have to push these square pegs into these round holes.
Very powerful, very powerful. And so we're appreciating all of your journeys to your current roles. And but what you were noticing was, well, what about?
What about?
This doesn't exactly align, and I can make it fit in. What's popping for me, honestly, at this moment was, so as a master's student, kind of with one of the greats around student development theory, Dr. Nancy Evans, back at Indiana University back in 19. I didn't know that I could say this didn't fit. Right?
That's powerful.
Right? And so my what I understood in that space and time back in the early 80s was, this is it. You have to fit.
Wow. Powerful.
Right? And so, find yourself in it, right? And I think the part of the beauty of this and the evolution in our work is the ability to say that doesn't fit, right? And that doesn't work. And that is not my truth in terms of my journey and my experience. And that mine is nuanced in a different way, giving these intersecting factors. And as Dr. Smith named, the importance of framing our experience not from a deficit space, right? That's a whole piece all in of itself, which is also work that has to, again, be done to enhance the identity development of minoritized populations. Because if we're taught to see our experiences from a deficit framework, that's how we navigate our programs, our services, all of the things that we do as we engage, the students that we are serving. So just very, very powerful, and want to use this time to really just invite other authors in to begin to talk about some of the journey. So all of you are going to get a chance to kind of say a little bit more about the titles of your chapters, right? And how you feel like that chapter particularly matters. And some of you have a couple of frame pieces as the editors, but this piece particularly was important as we do the work in this way. All right, does that feel okay as a process? So I want to move us now to Dr. Zarrina to come on in and just kind of introduce yourself and say a little bit about your title, your chapter, where you are, what you're doing, and why your piece mattered, and what was kind of your process in that. And then we'll keep moving. And folks, as we said, we want this to be dialogical, right? So, I can call on you as the next person, but it's like, I'm going to jump in right here because what Zarrina just said feels like a nice piece for my next part. Does that make sense? Okay, so we'll start with Dr. Zarrina. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I am Zarrina Azizova. I am assistant professor at the University of North Dakota. I am speaking from the lands of the Pembina and the Red Lake bands of the Ojibwe and the Dakota Oyet. And I'd like to, first of all, thank you for the opportunity of contributing to this amazing book, and also for today's opportunity to add a voice to the written word. I also would like to acknowledge and thank Dr. Jesse Mendez in partnership in this line of research, and for his voice as a Mexican-American scholar and leader in higher education. So I didn't write solo, and I just wanted to make sure that I acknowledge that as well. Right, yeah, so with the title of our chapter is Finding Meanings in the Models and Frameworks for Latinx College Students at the Intersection of the Student Agency and Context. And when we came up with a title and we were thinking, so the significance of our contribution to the volume is in the purpose of the chapter, which is to extend on the current argument and what we've heard so far already. The current argument is and perspective that college student development educators need to move their focus and shift their focus from what in the student development to more questions about how and where student development happens. Because when we look that way, we hope, there is a hope in this project to uncover new, alternative, inclusive theoretical perspectives of support. So we definitely connect our argument with the belief that students in higher education are for student success. So all student development theorists should be connected to the success outcomes, right? So that's the premise there as well. But in the significance of this chapter, I would say is, well, our writing in this chapter is intuitive and theoretical, but with some reliance on the prior qualitative research related to Latina student habitus and student agency. So in that earlier qualitative research, we were able to start seeing the elements of student agency, which is now is a time for me kind of to define that, how we use that. It is that it's defined in the social theory as a concept, as a construct, as an intentional act through power and will of a student. And that intentional act is situated in social, political, and sociocultural contexts. So we cannot separate those larger contexts. So in that definition, we propose and we say that instead of traditional theories where we see student development as a function of their interaction with the environment, we say it's a two-way process. So students are engaged in influencing their environments, just like they bring, because they bring their context, because they bring their identities, because they bring their histories of success or other stories into these environments, and it is a two-way interaction. So that's the idea behind the student agency. So I want to be clear here too, is that there's not much empirical research to draw from right now. We started seeing some of the student agency and student-centered learning literature. However, there is no something specific for specific populations. So with that to say that our chapter is not a conclusion. It's the beginning of the new student development theory or theories on student agency in general, and specific for Latin asterisk and Latinx student populations. So that's the beginning. And I'll stop here because I can just, continue talking later to say what are the key points from the chapter. But yeah, I'll pause right now.
Okay, great. Thank you. And the whole notion of student agency as a dynamic, as we understand and engage student development theory, and particularly the importance of that context as we talk about historically underrepresented or minoritized populations. It's just a very dynamic piece, and I really appreciate your naming. It's the start, right? And so I remember as I was writing my dissertation, it was, there was all of this. Well, who said that? Well, I said it. Right? Ain't nobody else write it down yet. So part of the journey and the challenge, I've got all this empirical, I've got all this anecdotal and experiential information, and it wasn't valid. Right? It didn't matter until it was kind of written down by somebody else. It was like, well, how are it going to get written down if, you don't let me write this down? Right? Absolutely. Very, very powerful. Stella, why don't you come on in and talk a little bit about your piece there?
Sure. So I have part of the introductory piece. But I'd also like to, if you don't mind, know you're a moderator, if we could pull our other chapter chapter author in, Dr.
Nicholas?
Yes.
Yeah, yes.
He made an amazing contribution to the book, and I just wanted to allow him to go.
Absolutely. That works perfectly. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay.
You're welcome.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, perfect. We're using this fancy technology at the college. So I'm actually, my students are with me listening in, and so now they'll be YouTube famous. But you know, thinking about this work, it's fascinating because your remarks, Dr. Washington and Doc Bonner, you know, for instance, I went in to do a PhD only because my stories, when no one would listen to them, you know, now that I have a PhD, they'll listen to them a little bit, you know, I'm still marginalized, but so the whole premise of, you know, FUBU stories, for us, by us, that we write these stories, but the Academy benefits. So thinking of that, I've always brought students with me. I've always brought my people with me. And our chapter is a great example of that. Daniel, I met Daniel and a transracial adoptee at Illinois State University in my first tenure track position. And so when we wrote that chapter, he was a master's student. Now he's a PhD student. He's going to be a dissertator soon at UNT Dallas or UNT in Denton. And so thinking about adoptees in the literature, there is research being written, but the domination of white scholars is profound. So when our chapter, our contribution was coming on the heels of a woman named Rachel Dolezal, who was in the media, who she was born white and she claimed that she was Black. And it really got us upset when people were using this whole notion of transracialism as if somehow you could change your race. And there was a piece in Hypatia, the Journal of Hypatia, that many people were asking for them to, you know, apologize for publishing a piece on transracialism. So as transracial adoptees, Daniel and I sought after to look at the models, and what we came up with was perhaps simple but profound in the sense of when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, you also have to think of belonging. And transracial adoptees, specifically Asian Americans who are adopted by white families, there tends to be not a feeling of belonging, because when they attempt to go to white spaces, and that might be Greek life, it might be other student organizations, they're looked at as exotic or different, perpetual foreigners. And then when they go to other Asian spaces, affinity groups, they might not be viewed as authentically Asian, right? Do you speak Korean? Do you speak Chinese? Do you practice cultural norms, right? And what we thought was that that's a notion of cisracial campuses, that your racial identity, when we look at your phenotypically and we think, okay, you're Asian, we put you into this box. And so that's where we were thinking about unboxing. We're kind of playing with this metaphor of unboxing. And so instead of placing folks into boxes, perhaps we could think of integrated spaces where folks like adopted people on college campuses and universities could be, you know, a safe space for them where they can unpack and learn, unlearn, relearn, learn for the first time things that pertain to their identity. I'll just share that I really was interested in identity when I did my PhD. I read a book that changed my life forever. It was written by John Palmer, a Korean adoptee, called Dance of Identities. And so I'm really appreciative of the editors for putting this volume together. I know it will be cited and used a lot, and that's important. Not to write these books that only one people read. I know, I mean, look at how many people have attended this webinar. a lot of people will be able to use the book and will be able to cite it and build from it. I liked Zarrina talking about this isn't just one, it's the beginning. It really is. It's a commencement. And so hopefully there'll be more books that come after it. And I think our chapter, if you're interested, I was hoping Dr. Sam Macias was going to be on, but chapter 6 on page 99 to take a look.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, Stella, for kind of inviting him in at this moment. So, again, as we talk about the specific contributions of each individual chapter, we're going to have our authors come back in and talk about kind of their key takeaways and highlights as folks are thinking about that. So, if you want to come in, why don't either Dr. Smith or Dr. Banda?
I can go ahead and go. So I think Dr. Banda also had a chapter in the book. She was doing some double duty, if I remember correctly. I don't have a specific chapter other than the introduction, but what I found was just the most profound around this text is this, the framing of diverse. Many times when we think about what is diverse or what is alternative, particularly when you're coming when your main editors are in an African-American space, they think you're going to sit in a racial space. And although that is extremely important, you'll find that the book also attends to issues of diversity of other indices. So it is a full intersectionality of diversity that is talked about within the book. And I think that that's important, particularly as you apply the alternative theories to spaces like HBCUs or spaces that people think are monolithic. They are not. So I leave this webinar saying Dr. Smith said that HBCUs were monolithic. They are not. But what do people sometimes assume about a space? And the power of using the theories that we have in the text in those kinds of spaces to understand diversity and to complicate diversity and the need for alternative approaches in some of those spaces. And so even when you're looking at just, the types of people or the types of experiences that people bring into the table and how that affects how we might interface with them as student affairs professionals. So I just found that that was a very profound piece of the text and also a complication of this idea of, okay, we're going to create these alternative approaches, but there are so many different types of students that are coming into higher ed, and we need to really be mindful of what their experiences are. I also think it's a jump off point for developing other theories. So I hope that it is a creative marker for people to consider other experiences, other alternative experiences, and begin to really codify and write down and share how they support those students.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The framing and the defining of diverse in and of itself, right, begins the process, right? So who are we talking about, right? And what all of that means as we navigate kind of this inclusion. And back to what Dr. Hartlep was naming was belonging, right? This sense of belonging and what all of that means. Dr. Banda.
So I wanted to share, I know we had co-authored some of the chapters, but we particularly had a chapter with a former student, Dr. Nikki Grava-Ternova, and she's the first author. So I definitely want to give her credence. This was a conceptual piece that we took from a course and worked it into a chapter and later refined it to be an extension of what she really decided to do her dissertation on, which was LatinX student athletes. She's a athletic advisor and has always been involved as a former collegiate athlete, et cetera. And so ours is the identity development of Latinx student athletes. And so I think to go back to further extend what Dr. Smith said, right, this chapter really looks at the intersectionality of not just individuals, but the dimensions of context within higher education, right? And how some can have this sense of belonging, as Dr. Hartlep noted, in certain spaces for certain students, but not for every student, right? So I think in this chapter, we pulled a conceptual piece together in terms of, we titled it Model of Identity Development of Latinx Student Athletes, and really looking at 3 different domains in terms of cultural, intellectual, and an athletic domain. And so this is something that was birthed from really trying to offer a counter narrative to stereotypes that we hear about college athletes. And so it really did kind of go through and do a deep dive and say, they're intelligent, there's an intellectual domain to them, there's also a cultural domain to them, and there's obviously also an athletic domain, right? But in some ways that the intellectual and the athletic domain, previous narratives always counter those, right? Like you cannot be, if you're an athlete, we've all heard the stereotype with it. And I think this was for her very personal, another labor of love in terms of being able to look at not just Latinx student athletes, but think about Latinx student athletes who are in non-revenue sports, for those who are in the collegiate sport world, also means a different set of resources and access to advisors and funding that add additional challenges to their times on university campuses. And so in terms of, I guess, takeaways, this is kind of one we don't hear a lot in terms of the literature about Latinx student athletes, and kind of being able to offer a counter narrative that's asset-based in terms of there is an intellectual domain, there's other domains to these students in terms of HSI. I think the other important piece that was noted by my colleagues as well was that this is kind of set within an HSI context. So the idea that you're brown and you're on an HSI campus means that you automatically belong, and that's not true, right? And so I think it does a good job also of looking at those nuances in terms of recognizing that that sense of belonging that our colleague noted earlier is a really, I think it's an oversimplified concept when we talk about it, and there's a lot of nuances to it in terms of how students experience college campuses. So.
Thank you. Thank you. Again, appreciating the missing piece around, so there is some writing that I think back to my own dissertation around the experiences of athletes, right? But again, that missing piece around the particular experience of Latinx, Latino, and Latina student athletes and what that means, right, in terms of this sense of belonging, and how that looks one way, particularly potentially at an HSI, right, but might look very differently in terms of the experience at an HBCU, at a PWI, so that whole nuance opportunity to just kind of dig deeper and to just consider broader. Yep. Dr. Bonner, you want to come in?
Sure, yes, sir. I have the intro chapter that I wrote in collaboration with the editors, Dr. Banda, Smith, and Marbley. And just to kind of give you a bit of insight about that chapter. In that chapter, we really wanted to set the stage. And we went back to the seminal theory, seminal research, and we went back to the cornerstone theory of college student development, and that is Lewin's interactionist paradigm. Behavior is a function of the person times the environment. So we started there, but one of the things that we try to problematize and deconstruct about Lewin's theory and how we've actually operationalized that theory in the field of student affairs is that behavioral outcomes are a function of the person times the environment. We haven't paid homage like we should to the environment, but definitely when we look at the person, it's been a focus on a specific swath of individuals, of people, typically white, typically male, and typically a population that has not looked like me, Dr. Banda, Dr. Marbley. So we really wanted to set the stage to say that this book is going to be an exploration. We've sojourned in this land for a long time, listening to the Astons, to the Ericksons. And again, we're not trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater. These are foundational theories. But these foundations have been foundations upon which we built little white frame houses. Well, now we've evolved. we have structures now on top of those foundations that are not just little white framed houses. We have these buildings, these edifices that have populations that are just not traditional families. We have edifices that have like families that are like multidisciplinary, multi-unit families, multiple perspectives, multiple ideas. So we've had to evolve, and our theories have not done that. One of the things that I always say to my doctoral students, I'm teaching a doctoral dissertation seminar this semester, and I always hammer this point in the class is that, for our students, I said, most of you are completing dissertations and dissertation research that focuses on populations of color. I get that. However, how can you complete a dissertation that has focused on populations of color and you have not cited one author of color? You have not cited the diverse theories, the diverse perspectives. So I think that's a bit criminal. And part of that problem is that we have not had the literature out there that has given us the intellectual space and place to be able to quote and cite those authors. I mean, we've had some here and there, but it's nice to have a compendium where folks can go pull out the shelf in your college student affairs classes, in your student development courses, in your higher ed courses. We're hoping in your sociology courses, we're hoping that this will be a book that you will use because it gives you just the thing we try to give, an alternative perspective that focuses on diverse populations.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, I appreciate you, again, as you name, you're writing about, you're doing a dissertation on, but you're not quoting, you're not citing any of the folks who are, right?
Criminal.
Right? Exactly. Yes, I did hear you, Dr. Baughman. It was criminal, right? There should be a law. It should not be allowed to happen without it, right? So I'm on 2 dissertation committees right now, so you got me focused then on have you, right? So, okay, exactly. Wanna keep us moving. And again, this is your opportunity to, kind of put some things in the chat. If you've got some questions the question and answer space is open as we continue along this process. I want to talk for a little bit about how you see, again, this book being used, right? And so Dr. Banda offered at one level some things around, as doc students, but as we think about, there's probably some folks who are here who are practitioners as well, right? So what do you think about how this piece will contribute to the field? And so anyone can jump in around specifically as I think about the piece that we did. You go theory to practice, right? So how and what ways we might do that. So anyone feel ready to just really jump right in there? Or I can call on folks.
I can offer a couple of ideas that I've been thinking, and we have a section in the chapter that provides some recommendations, but the main message, the main takeaway from that is that new, what we call an alternative or inclusive college development theories should prompt educators and practitioners to run diagnostics. Are we ready? Institutionally. So what does the institutional readiness means? Because we should be. And so theories that as we see them and in the entire book do emphasize structures, conditions, and we talked about spaces and all of that. So there are bits and pieces now to use for self-assessments. So when we use those college development theories, it's not only just about to know what happens to students, it's are we ready to support that development? In our case, are we ready to empower student agency? Do we know what are the sources of student agencies? And I would like to cite here the other author in the book, Dr. Karina Chantal-Knava, and when she talks about the possible sources of student agencies are in the concepts of familismo and conocimiento. So do we know what it means for our institutions? So if we read and engage with those theories, I think practitioners would just need to pay attention. What are the structural conditions that need to be present and what changes need to be done? The other thing that I would like to emphasize, because we talk about student agency in our chapter, is to invite feedback loop, generate feedback loop with the students. It's to give them opportunity to know that they have A, power, B, will, assume that they're active participants. You know, historically, all other frames assume that we are influencing this change on them. It's not how it works. And history taught us the major changes to the institutions happened because students brought those changes to us, right? So I think these are the these two things that I would recommend practitioners to take away from the entire book for all the populations.
Absolutely, very powerful. Yeah. Who wants to jump in? Jump in on that one. That was very powerful.
Powerful.
Ways that we might apply any particular piece. Yes, Dr. Banda.
Yeah, I was gonna, I agree with Dr. Zarrina, right? Like, I think that's a great point in terms of keeping our own scorecards of what we're doing. And so I think for us, in terms of recommendations, that were much more just in terms of a philosophical base, not necessarily, but philosophical in action. And a lot of it is really just, I think when we start to validate alternative critical epistemologies, it also makes people uncomfortable, which is great, but it forces people to check their privilege. And I think that's something that we forget to do based on, it could be training, based on context, based on just closing the blinds to critical alternative epistemological frameworks that exist, right? And so I think this book in many ways, and our chapter, but the book in general, I think it's a call for people to check your privilege, including the privilege of scholars of color who have privilege because you have 3 degrees, right? So in what ways are we being an advocate for students in these spaces, or are we perpetuating systemic inequities, right? And so when we talk about this critical consciousness lens or this praxis of reflection and action, I always tell my doctoral students, it's easy to problematize and criticize systems, etc. But what we really need to do, the real work, is in doing it to ourselves. Like you need to problematize yourself and determine whether A, if you are adding to the systemic inequities, or if you're problematizing those systems, right? And so I think this book kind of gives it the foreground that we can validate, there is validation to alternative epistemological frameworks, regardless of what the Academy has told us historically, right? In terms of what we should value. And that gives us an opportunity to check the privileges, be aware of the systemic inequities, and have that level of praxis in terms of that. And then above all, embrace an asset-based lens. That's something that's very important in terms of when we look at historically marginalized populations. And sometimes, because it's such a product of a banked method of education, a lot of it is unconscious, some of it's malicious, and we know it is, and some of it's just unconscious. It's just kind of a normalized way of framing populations. But I think that there is, if nothing else, there's great empowerment from this book because it validates people in spaces that have not been validated academically in this arena. And that can be done also when you go and sit in meetings and like Dr. Bonner said, not be criminal, right? If you're talking about equity and issues, then you should be talking about those frameworks offered by scholars of color.
Thank you. So you just said a webinar full in that space, right? So this whole, the whole reason for this book is we wouldn't need to have square pegs in a round hole if, in fact, right, there had not been these round holes, right, that were created without us in mind, if you will, right, from our mind. And so again, as we are engaging, as we are teaching, as we are inviting, even examination, there is a requirement that, again, as Dr. Smith named, when we even define diverse, right, who are in fact we're talking about as we talk about the square pegs, right, and how is the round hole privileged, right, as the space that needs to be fit into, right? What does that look like? What does that mean? What does it look like in our scholarship? What does it look like in our practice, praxis? The very powerful piece, particularly as we are using not only this information to inform our practice, but also teach how to practice, getting folks to really understand that this is the notion of privilege, right, has to be one that's engaged. And so I want to invite that conversation. Yes, please, come on, Dr. Hart.
Yeah, can I say one thing too?
Please.
I'm new to Kentucky. I joined the faculty here right before the COVID pandemic took effect. And I recently learned that Kentucky, like other states, has a program by which if a student is adopted, when they graduate high school, if they meet certain criteria, they can obtain a scholarship to attend an in-state institution of higher education. Thinking about privilege, it's a privilege that folks would just create policies here. This sounds like a great policy. Let's give adopted kids, let's give foster kids access scholarship. That's well and good, but wouldn't it be even better if there was research done to see how well those students fared? Did they feel like they belonged on college? What are their graduation rates relative to non-adopted, non-foster kid backgrounds? And that's precisely why a book like this is so profound, is it's asking the right questions. Up until now, what problems are viewed as important enough to do research? And it seems to me there's a critical mass of existing scholars, but up and coming scholars, junior faculty, graduate students, who are willing to really ask the tough questions. And that's all I wanted to insert in terms of going back to that practical application. What someone would say, well, you're just theorizing. Not really. We're theorizing, but we're theorizing in a direction that we need to go as institutions of higher learning become more female. There's more female students pursuing degrees, as well as the racial and ethnic diversity is changing. That's something that we cite in our chapter, that there's almost a convergence here, more diverse students in our college classrooms. And so I just think that maybe perhaps, I know the editors are tired, but maybe there needs to be further work after they catch their breath, and we can get more people. If you're on this webinar and you're listening and would like to do that work, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be interested in looking at the Commonwealth of Kentucky or others, wherever we can get data on transracial adoptees and their outcomes.
Excellent. Well, what I'm appreciating again, Dr. Hartlep, that you're raising again is that this again invites us into some, as Dr. Zarrina also offers to the next round of questions, right? As we get, intend intentionally to serve for the next round, our next this diverse population, right? And what is coming up for me as well is this notion of, so what's the resistance, right? What's the pushback that you found as we consider this work, right? And I know that as you started talking, as Dr. Hartlep was talking about this next generation of junior faculty, many of who are BIPOC and Native and Indigenous folks, many of who are willing to ask some of the critical questions, right? Is that scholarship beyond dissertation, right? Right. So is that scholarship beyond dissertation, being supported? What's some of the resistance and stuff that you, as you think about, kind of showing up with this, not only as, spaces to cite, but also as things to inform our practice. So anyone want to jump in around that?
Well, I'll jump in and say, a very great question and excellent comments by all the authors, Dr. Zarrina, Dr. Banda, Dr. Smith, and Dr. Hartlep. Just amazing stuff. And to your point, or to your question, the resistance has been, I think back when I was a junior faculty member at the University of Texas, San Antonio, and one of my mentors, a faculty member at that time, he's a faculty emeritus now, Dr. Raymond Padilla. And I can remember I was there in the room copying, getting ready for class. And I was saying to Dr. Padilla, I said, you know what, I need to do some more empirical work. I have some research studies, I'm doing some empirical work, but so many of my articles right now are theoretical. So I need to move towards doing more empirical. He said, no. He said, you need to balance it out because as Black and brown people, we don't get the opportunity to theorize. Our theories are not out there. So yes, you do need to do the empirical stuff. Yes, do the studies, run the data, do that. But don't discount the fact that you're doing important theoretical work because as people of color, we're not allowed to theorize. So one of the things that I always tell my students in class, I say problematize and deconstruct. And one of the things I say is, just because a white person wrote it down doesn't mean it's so. Let's problematize and deconstruct. I tell them all the time, I say, everyone has issues. People magazine has issues. But how do we take an issue and make that issue out of a problem? Because we can attack and solve a problem. And also, how do we go from theory to practice back to theory?
Yep.
Because again, as Dr. Padilla said, and it stuck with me, and this was all the way back in like 2002, he said, no, young scholar, we as Black and brown people don't get to theorize. So it is important for you to be in those theoretical spaces. So I'm hoping that folks will take this book, use it to craft different theories, use it as a launching pad to think of new approaches, alternative approaches, and citing these authors in the book to ensure that we're theorizing about ourselves. As Dr. Hartlep said, for us, by us.
Anybody else want to jump in around that thoughts of not only having experienced some resistance or thoughts about resistance, but kind of what you anticipate or have seen around some of that work?
I would add some. I think part of it is also, it's not just the writing of it, but it's also the capital of the academy. So being able to publish it in different spaces, being able to actually build a tenure dossier on it. So you have to be very, when you're doing this work, you have to be very, you have to have a tribe that is helping you do this work, in my opinion. So one, you have to understand your colleagues and the group of scholars that are also part of your cabal. And so what's wonderful about this book is that now we're a cabal, right? We're all working on issues focused on alternative approaches to diverse college student development. So when Dr. Bonner says to our class, well, where are your scholars of color? Now we also have names, right? And so we're not asking our students to go out and try to find those scholars. We can give them scholars that we know are doing this work and encourage that. And that's part of the currency of academia. But then also, now that we have so many more BIPOC, non-traditional individuals that have moved up in academia, we have access to the capital of academia. We have access to publication, access to be able to even have a book like this. It was an idea, but it had to get published. Just because people write stuff doesn't mean to get published. So, when you're thinking about
That's right.
The main scholars that we have in the field and the Dr. Bonners and, our seminal scholars in the field, we benefit now from the struggle that they had before. So as we continue to build, and as those of us that are coming now can connect to those scholars and use that as a springboard to not only be able to be true to the topic that we had in our dissertation, not have to change that because now we're trying to get tenure, but we can also build our full, our full careers on these ideas and challenge what traditional academia looks like.
Very, very powerful.
So I think that this is a very critical time in which we now have this pipeline of scholars that can help raise everyone else up and those that are interested in these topics.
Absolutely. We get to shift the narrative. I remember a quote during my dissertation process is the spirit of scholarship, and was euphemism for white enough, right? And so that the quality, as you talk about theorizing and empirical data and so on, that if it wasn't done in this way, if it didn't meet if your frameworks didn't operate in this way, then it didn't meet the spirit of scholarship. And so what do you do with it? What do you do with that, right? Whose spirit, right? Again, as we talk about this whole notion of for us, by us, is a thing. Fred?
Dr. Jamie, I just wanted to say that kind of tagging on what Dr. Smith said, there is something to be said for these venues that provide the intellectual and dialectical space for us to talk about these diverse issues. So from the very beginning, Stylus and John Von Noring, they have been, I actually nominated John. I previously served as the Vice President for Research for the American Association of Blacks in Higher Ed. So I nominated him for one of our awards. And one of the things that I said about him is that from the very beginning, John has been such a champion, and Stylus has been such a champion of these issues of diversity. When no one else would publish us of some of the stuff we were doing, John would. And same thing I'll say about Routledge. I have a book series with them. They've given me the intellectual space, and that's important too.
It is absolutely important, right? Because again, as you named, it's one thing to write, it's another thing to get it published, and who's going to support this work, increasing the capacity of our students and our institutions. Very, very, very important. We're coming up on time, and I do want to again continue to invite folks into the question and answer spaces. If you've got any specific questions you want to ask of any of the panelists, and if you want to specifically about their chapters, or just about this whole notion of diverse college student development theories, please go ahead and put those in, and we'll try to reach out and grab those. I do want to ask, as you consider your chapters, and again, as Dr. Zarrina named, this is the start, right? So for those of us who are out there, right, who might consider the next, right, what might you invite us to do, right? So this is the part we ain't get to do, we ain't get to think about, or we couldn't get to in this volume, right? And so just 2 or 3 questions, because again, I know we have master's students, we got doctoral students, we've got faculty members who are looking for areas that can build on this work, right? And so if you had 1 or 2 things that you might invite into the next realm, the next part of the work, what would you say to folks? And I'll start with Dr. Zarrina, and then you get to invite the next person in.
Well, I personally think let's roll the sleeves and go on the field and interact with the students, so that we do not write about them, but we write with them. And that's the next project here. So if we want to enlarge student agency on our campus, and I just wanted to also specify that the way we used LatinX, we used it as an umbrella term, and I know nationally right now there is discourse whether it is inclusive identifier. So in this case, we just used it as an umbrella term to bring together very diverse cultural groups, right? So we do not claim that for all, but we all say that there is a common denominator for those groups is the histories of oppression, of exclusion, the struggle for educational success, resilience, and we brought a little bit of those histories. So I think now the next project is to go and engage with all these communities, you know, one by one, and then learn from them, listen to the students. As I said, they bring so much wealth of knowledge to our understanding what college student development is, should, could be for institutions. And we invite for the collective qualitative research out there. So we started some here at UND with my colleague, Jocelyn Gutierrez, and we have doctoral students here. So we hope to produce more. So thank you.
Excellent. So who would you like to invite in?
I will go, I cannot do that. Don't put it on me. I want everybody. So
okay. Who's next? Who's ready? Who's ready to come in? Well, I guess go ahead, Dr. Banda.
I'll share the same sentiments that Dr. Zarrina had said in terms of it's a lot of work. I mean, for those of us who are faculty or not faculty, but you're working with students and you're dealing with identity development or even having the discussions about critical epistemologies, I don't know about y'all, but I'm exhausted. Like I'm emotionally done after class. Like I have to sit back and reflect and take a breather for me because it's a lot of work, right? It's not a burden. It's a lot of work in terms of the work that we need. And so I really think when we talk about college student development and we talk about and we read about all these chapters and these alternative critical epistemological frameworks, I think the next step is adding another layer of looking at these injustices or these oppression and so forth, but looking at it from a policy perspective, whether it's a department policy, whether it's a university policy. Dr. Hartlep, I know he had to leave, but he was talking about it from a state policy. And policy is where the power is at, right? Because policy is what governs our behavior. So if we're talking about there's no sense of belonging or there's no resources or I really think that the next step for it to be actionable has to take a policy perspective. Like if we are in positions of, I always tell everybody that we each have a sphere of influence, right? I may not have a direct line to the president, but you know, I may be able to get to the provost, or I may be able to get to the chair, I may be able to get to somebody at NSF for help on a grant to address some of these equities in terms of resources or so forth. And so I really think it's part of networking and relying on our community of scholars to work collectively, but also to really take a really hard look at policy in terms of policy that we're promoting or policy that we have yet tried to disrupt or problematize in certain spaces. And so I would say that's probably the next step among others, but I think that one's a very important one to continue from this work.
Beautiful. Yeah, absolutely. So appreciating again, both of those comments around. So let's get with the students and write with them, right? Not just about them. Very, very, very powerful framework. Again, that's a shifting of the narrative in terms of where does wisdom come from? Where does knowledge come from? Right. But are their voices enough, right? For us to be able to build our knowing on. And as Dr. Rosa is naming there, this whole notion of how we then create systemic change is by us addressing and engaging policy. So we look at these theoretical frameworks and so on. And as we think about these particular pieces, what's policy got to do with it, right? And how is it informing that? And then how do we begin to shift that? And so kind of even doing policy scan might be another piece of work through the lens of this particular piece, right? Very powerful. Stella.
Yeah, so as you were talking, I was also thinking about this book as being a support and an acknowledgement of those individuals that do student development work. So when Dr. Banda was talking about, you know, when we teach these theories, we're exhausted. So when you think about those scores of individuals that are in the schools or in the institutions, actually working with the students and implementing these theories as they are supporting them, particularly in this moment As we're dealing with the pandemic, we're dealing with students having been gone for 18 months. We are dealing with online learning. We're dealing with the systemic racism. You know, I hope that as those scholars or those if they're students and they're reading it, so they might be reading it from a more scholarly lens, or if they're practitioners reading it in order to get takeaways, that they understand that we see them. You know, we see that what they do and in the space that supports our students. I think often we might not think about the theories that come behind all of the work that student affairs professionals do. And I just want to, I hope that when they read this text or when other people read this text, they understand how difficult and how complex it is to be a part of the student affairs profession and to help to guide students in partnership with what we do as faculty and on the academic side, so that they leave our institutions ready to do whatever it is they came to the institution to do. So I would hope that the work honors those student affairs professionals as well, as we bring light to the complexity, what they do on a day-to-day basis to support our students.
Very powerful. As a next, and again, another piece, right? To engage those who are positioned to deliver, right, upon this work that we are framing and putting out there, and how do we serve, and what does it look like to operationalize, and what's it look like to see what I've been trying to say in action, right, in terms of the work. Yeah, excellent. Fred.
Yes, sir. I just want to just very briefly just say that again, I think that we have to really work to reframe the narrative. We know at the core of student affairs is our mantra, a concern for the whole student. That's what we do. Well, what does wholeness mean? Because from the very beginning, we've said whole, but I'm not whole if I'm not represented on the landscape in the literature. So how do we start to reframe, and how do we start to use books like Square Pegs to tell that counter narrative in a way that amplifies who we are, what we do, and what we bring to the table as far as student affairs? And I would say that another thing that we have to do is to really find ways to infiltrate in a good way into the major organizations like ACPA, NASPA, AERA, and ASH to create a groundswell around the literature, you know, well, square pegs, but not just square pegs, looking at some of those alternative theories that are out there to ensure that our higher ed populations are really getting their needs met. Their learning, growth, and development is being considered.
Absolutely. And so, folks, if you are thinking about text for your next student development theory class, if you are thinking about a professional development opportunity in terms of having so for your teams to look at and find chapters to have some conversations about, if you are looking at, even as you do student leadership stuff, right, and working with minoritized populations, if you're thinking about a next conference program that you might do, right, that this is a very solid piece of work to ground some of your, and what we are inviting into looking here and seeing what's missing, not seeing it as finished, not problematize the work that we've done, even in this space, right, to make sure that other voices are represented. Try this out at some parts of this out with a group, again, as Zarrina says, at a student retreat, student leadership retreat, or student multicultural student retreat. And do you see yourself reflected in these frameworks as they are offered and shared? So there's just so many different spaces and ways that we might begin to engage this work that's so powerful. I want to thank each of you for your voices, for your labors of love, as we have done this, and as we consider the work for the next round, right, and how, in fact, we can create spaces where this work is cited so much in the upcoming dissertations and master's thesis, that full conference programs are done about it, and so on. So again, thank you to our editors for your leadership, for your thoughtfulness around this, and to all of those who are listening. There's opportunity from this space to continue the work forward. I'm going to hand it back to Dr. Bonner, and we can move to the closing of our time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Washington. I want to thank all of these brilliant panelists, the editors. Thank you, Dr. Banda. Thank you, Dr. Smith. Thank you, Dr. Marbley. I know she's somewhere in flight, but I really want to thank our panelists today, Dr. Zarrina, Dr. Nicholas, and the good brother Jamie. You just brought it home. So just made it such an engaging time. So really appreciate you. And Patty, I appreciate you and all the work that you and John are doing at Stylus to get our voices out there.
Thank you so much, Fred, and thank you everyone who tuned in with us live. The book Square Pegs and Round Holes, Alternative Approaches to Diverse College Student Development Theory is available on the Stylus Pub website. We will share the source code to get a discount off the book. You all will get a follow-up thank you email with all of that information on Monday. We also want to invite you to part 2 of the Square Pegs and Round Holes webinar, which will be next Thursday, same time, same place. And you can find those links on our registration page on the Stylus website. I will share all of this information in our chat bar. So if you want to hang out after we close the meeting, you'll have that information available, but you'll also receive the information in a follow-up email. So thank you all very, very much.
Absolutely.
And we hope you have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.